Going where the silence is. The QUO Podcast.
Welcome to the QUO Podcast. I'm Ally, and today I'm chatting to Steff Fenton, a queer non-binary pastor at the LGBT+ inclusive New City Church, which has a strong focus on creating a safe space for worship for LGBT+ people. So Steff, I want to start off quite personal. I want to get a little bit of an insight into the role that religion played in your life as a child and young adult. So yeah, can you speak a little bit to this question?
Yeah, so I have always identified as a Christian, and I think part of that is that I always felt like I had an identity as someone who was made in the image of God, inherently worthwhile, also equally as important as everyone else in the world, like nothing puts me above someone else, loved by that God, forgiven, and I guess a sense of purpose as well to create justice and love in community. And then also just had a lot of fun on Friday nights at youth group playing games that I would probably think are really awkward now. But
what are we talking? Are we talking like?
Just like kind of gross stuff like eating raw eggs and, games where it's just kind of like a lot of peer pressure and anyways, but I had a lot of fun. So I guess that was kind of like the role of religion in my life, is it gave me a sense of identity and worth, a purpose in life and a sense of belonging as well.
I feel that like sense of community would be a huge thing. I guess, how did you feel your identity as a Christian and your identity as a queer person sort of intersected and conflicted when you were grappling with that as a young person?
Well, thankfully I was like very naive about my sexuality and gender identity for a lot of my adolescent years. So it wasn't until I was 19 that I realised, I think I really like a girl, and just kind of fumbled my way into a relationship with my best friend at the time. Originally that was really, really shameful, and there was like huge, immense amounts of shame and secrecy and darkness around that relationship, that things would happen between us, and immediately I would just be like, this is so wrong, I feel so guilty. I would rock up at church on Sundays and just be like, all of these words about judgment and sin, they're all about me, like just real heaviness in my gut about who I was. And I remember talking to a friend about it when I eventually like built up the courage to let someone in, and was just like, if you think you've done things that are bad, like I've done the worst. So that was how I originally felt about who I was when I was like grappling with being gay.
So a lot of self-hatred, I feel.
Yeah, because you're taught, and this is still a mainstream teaching in the church, is that being any form of queer is sinful and not part of God's plan. And it's words like twisted and fallen and depraved and just like awful language about our identities.
So I understand, I'm not super religious myself, but there is an understanding in Christian sort of teachings that everyone is sinful in certain ways. Is there a hierarchy of sin, with sort of being queer or gay quite at the top of that? So there's that added stigma there? Yeah,
it is interesting. I think it certainly feels like queerness is the ultimate embodiment of the world gone wrong, or like the sinful infiltration of there's kind of like flesh and spirit, which are sort of these two binaries that are often opposed in some teachings in the Bible. And there's like don't be conformed to the world, like kind of these fleshly desire, like out of control images. That's like queerness is the epitome of that, of like just unleashing and not caring at all about God. So I don't know how we got there. Actually, I do. Yeah. But that's just kind of where we're at, that it is. It's put up above other things.
So the church that you grew up in, can you speak a little bit about how they treated people in their congregation who were LGBT plus? Like, I'm assuming the answer is that they weren't very inclusive, or that they might have been forcibly excommunicated.
Yeah, so I grew up hearing things like, someone would say, "Oh, is that man gay?" And I would hear someone else say, "Oh no, don't be silly, they're Christian." So there's this dichotomy of these two identities just being utterly opposed. As I was grappling with my sexuality and I let people in on that, I remember coming out to my minister for the first time, and a year prior to that day, he'd taken me out for lunch and said, "Steff, you are one of 3 core leaders in this church, and this church will not survive without you. Thank you so much. I just want to take you out for lunch to just say thanks so much for everything that you do here. You're such a core leader." Fast forward a year later, and I'm there saying, "Hey, I think I'm gay, and I can't. I've tried to resist it, but it is just not working, and so I need to figure out how I put these two things together," and was in a moment removed from all leadership within my community. I was able to come sit in the pews every week. No one checked in on me. Friends who were leading Bible studies, who were sort of like my smaller community group, had noticed, and they were like, "Oh, do you want to go out for a coffee? We've kind of noticed that you haven't been involved." And I thought, oh, great, someone's noticed and someone cares about me. But when I got there, they said, "Look, we've noticed this. What are your views?" And I said, "Well, I really don't know. I'm just questioning and I'm grappling, and I don't know. I'm sort of in this dark place where I don't know where to stand anymore. Just figuring it out." And they said, "Well, unless you can conform to the teaching of the church, you'll no longer be able to be part of Bible studies." And then 5 years later, I was told I couldn't take part in communion, which is like a sacrament of the Lord's Supper. It's the sacrament that Jesus says, here is my body and blood given for you freely the night before he dies. It's in some of the gospel stories. And I was told that you can't take part in this sacrament anymore because we want to visibly show that you're out of communion with this church. So there's just awful things like that happening to people who have no support networks. It's done behind closed doors. People are completely shamed and excommunicated, and it goes on most days in the churches.
That's really concerning. And I guess you seem to have been forging your own path, becoming a pastor and being an advocate for this. But there are a lot of LGBT or, gender diverse people who don't have that support. So do you have insight into some of the experiences that other people who are similar to you but might have had different trajectories have had in terms of grappling with this conflict between their Christian identity and LGBT or gender diverse identity? All of our stories are pretty similar, to be honest, and we gather a lot of them in the church that we've started, this new church that we've started. So we have a lot of queer people who come with the same stories of just feeling immense amounts of shame, of grappling, of people having immense amounts of love and belonging for them until in a split second their identity makes them someone to be feared, someone who we stay away from them. It's conform or be cut off because these is just the narratives. These are the stories for people. So in this environment, I find it really interesting and somewhat inspiring that you've kind of decided to become a pastor, because it's not a very welcoming environment for people like you. So what sort of inspired you down this journey of becoming a pastor?
Firstly, I found people who were reading the Bible differently. And I remember the day that I had read a book which was basically, that there's these 6 clobber passages that are often used to say that God, diverse sexuality and gender identities are sinful. And they're kind of used over and over again. And I read a book that actually said, we don't need to read them this way. Here's another way of reading them. And I remember after I had read one passage which had just been weaponized against me over and over again, I read an alternative reading of that, which was talking about the unjust power dynamics of some of the sexual, descriptions of sexuality in the Bible, that it's actually like a power imbalance or a hierarchy and a misuse of, or a selfishness or something like that, that I was like, oh yeah, I think this could be it. And I kind of heard this voice that just said, you can rest now, Steff. And it was the first time in my life that I had read one of those scripture passages and it hadn't been like a hit over the head, like that's what the weaponization of these words can be. And then I think I slowly found my way into communities where other queer Christians were, and I saw people, married, they had, married in inverted commas because Australia didn't have same-sex marriage at the time, but they had done all these secret ceremonies, and I saw queer Christians just living their lives and living those two identities together. And the whole time I had just this sense of, again, those three things that sort of underpinned my faith as a young person, of being inherently worthy and loved by God, that nothing could change that, because that's what Jesus does. And this sense of purpose of equality and justice and love in the world, but justice became really big for me, and I saw how much God cares about the underdog and the marginalized, how God is rooting for the person who has been excommunicated or who has been excluded. I just knew that and found that so much more during that journey. And then I found this new community of belonging. So I think those things, I found them in new ways. And then that just kind of spurred me on to try to create those spaces for more people, and to explore more reading, and to explore that God who is on the side of the oppressed, and lifting them up, and really discovering and exploring that.
If you are enjoying this episode, please support us by rating and reviewing this podcast, visiting our website, thequo.com.au, and following us on our socials using the handle @thequoAU.
Did you ever feel conflicted about becoming a pastor, given how LGBT plus exclusionary most Christian religious institutions are? And I guess from what you're saying, it sounds like your perspective is more on the side of trying to sort of reform those institutions to become more LGBT plus inclusionary.
Yeah. So I do a lot of advocating to help the church be better, and to listen to stories, because there's just story after story after story which is the same, and I'm just gobsmacked that they don't want to listen to the thousands of stories that are out there of the harm that's happened. So hopefully we'll get there, and it's my prayer that more and more churches will reach out, and more pastors will reach out and ask, how can we do this better? But yeah, when we started New City Church, there's a lot wrong with the church institutions. The inherent power dynamics that happen and hierarchies. So we tried to create a co-pastor model, which was more like equality, sharing power. I think we've grappled with that as we've started the church, of what have we seen done really badly, and how do we not do that and not perpetuate that, and do something different and offer a model of a different way of doing church to others who see it and want to join in.
So I think it'd be great if you gave us a little bit more insight into New City Church, what it is exactly, and why you decided to form this new church community.
Yeah, basically we were a bunch of queer Christians, and some of us who had been ministers before. So the two people who I co-pastor with have both been ministers in other denominations, and we just sort of found ourselves in friendship thinking, there's no real church for us. So why don't we just get together and start our own? And so we talk about creating the church that we needed for ourselves, and then we started inviting other people into it. And so, we started the journey finding a lot of healing ourselves, a lot of that community, and then more and more people have joined us. Our 3 core values are Jesus, justice, and community, which sort of speaks a little bit about what we're about. We say that we're a church, doing church on the margins, and I think that's part of our identity, is really trying to deconstruct what church is. That, our pastors don't all agree on what's like right belief, or right belief would even be a weird word for us to use, because there's just a baseline understanding that everyone's going to think differently, and the diversity of the people who connect with God reflects the diversity of that God. And so we come into this space, and if you have no faith or you believe something different, great, like that's a strength, and that's a beautiful thing, and that's a wonderful thing. I think what we are really huge about is safety and belonging, no matter what. So rather than, you have to believe this or you have to go, it's more like treat people well. And I think I think people tangibly feel that when they walk into the space, is that this is a hospitable space where you're going to be accepted and loved for who you are. You can breathe out. And a lot of people who visit for the first time say those things about our space, which is just, it's such an honour and a beautiful thing to cultivate that for other people.
Yeah, well, I actually went to New City on Sunday, as you know, first time, and it was a wonderful and unexpectedly wonderful experience. I'm not religious at all, and I guess I had, even though you'd explained a little bit about what was involved, some preconceived ideas of what church was, but arriving there and just seeing the lounges, I was like, wow, this is chill, this is awesome. And I guess what struck me was, for the first time, I didn't feel like I was kind of just being lectured to, like, this is what you need to believe, like, this, if you don't have faith, if you believe something different, or if you take what you want from what you were saying. So I was really struck by that, because when you were preaching, I thought, wow, a lot of this resonates with me. As a non-religious person, I can actually gain some strength from this idea of, growth and plurality. Thank you for sort of breaking the stigma that I actually had internalized around the church. And I guess something that really struck me as well, that there wasn't a communion or any of those, normal things that I associate with church. So that was obviously a very conscious choice for you guys when you created the community.
Yeah, it's very contemporary and relaxed, although some weeks we do communion, but it's probably not, if you've been to a Catholic church or a more traditional church, it wouldn't look like that. It's very open table, and we talk about building a bigger table. And I think, like, our vision statement is that all would find refuge and life in Jesus. And so it's a space of coming in, finding healing and protection, that refuge, and then finding a space to breathe out and then find life, like to regrow, to build. We believe that aliveness comes from finding God in your life, but if you come and you don't connect in that way, you're welcome to. We have people who say, look, I can hear that you all believe this. I haven't found it yet, but I just like the community, so I'll keep coming back. Well,
I feel like this is quite a new community. So how long has New City been going on for, to start off with?
We started July 2020. So we joke about starting a church in a pandemic, but I think for a lot of us who have awkward family situations and may have been in lockdown in houses that were potentially unsafe for people, I think it was the most poignant time to start a church. We're, 17 months old.
Yeah, so it is very new. Like, what's your vision for how this church community is going to grow and evolve in the future?
Yeah, I think we've just started, we've got through the pandemic, it feels kind of. And I think we're starting to turn our faces towards the future and some strategic planning and what that might look like. I think thoroughly central is just this deep sense of community, that people have deep relationships with one another and feel seen and known and loved. That's a belief of ours about God, that God sees you, knows you, loves you, and that's how community should be. But then I have big dreams that we will, as queer Christians, lead the rest of the church in conversations around gender and sexuality, because often the church is the worst perpetuators of patriarchy and bad sexuality, really. Like sexuality that says if you're a man and a woman and you're doing it in marriage, then it's good sex, but leaves out any conversation around consent and respect and pleasure, particularly female pleasure. There's a whole history of purity culture, which is its own thing, where it was like you must be pure until marriage, and there were awful images about like a cup being passed around and being spit in by everyone, and it's like if you have sex before marriage, it's like you're this dirty thing of everyone's spit is in you. Like that's how dirty you are if you've had sex before marriage, like you've been passed around. So like gross stuff that a lot of people are still recovering from. And we have this beautiful community that's deconstructing all of that, living outside of the binary, breaking things open. And so I would hope that we would, we'd be a church that leads that conversation, along with the conversation around like, what does it mean not to live in boxes? And what does it mean to have dialogue across difference and empathy for and openness around a range of identities? I think we're just so primed to gift that to the church. And I say the church as in like, the broader church, all denominations, anyone who, is part of that Christian movement.
Breaking down boundaries, breaking down labels. I love it. And I guess it relates also to your more recent coming out experience as a non-binary person. So I'm interested, from your personal lived experience, how does your identity as a non-binary queer person influence, your perspective of religion, the church, and your work as a co-pastor?
Yeah, I just finished a master's thesis on gender expansiveness and the kingdom of God. And so in the Gospels, in the Bible, Jesus is said to come with a new kingdom, and it's a kingdom which challenges the Roman Empire and uses a lot of the same language. But it's like the Roman Empire was hierarchical, it was violent, it segregated 90% of the people into peasants who were forced to pay taxes and lived very hard lives. And then this alternative kingdom that Jesus brings is about everyone, the first will be last and the last will be first, and everyone is slaves in inverted commas, and everyone serves one another, and you know how you've seen people lord it over someone else, not so among you. And it's this like complete confrontation of patriarchy and hierarchy that Jesus actually says everyone, like, blessed are the poor who you've said are actually unworthy. I'm going to say actually yours is this kingdom, like this kingdom is yours. These are some of the teachings that surround that. And like I wrote about this figure of eunuchs who are gender expansive, and they're connected with the kingdom of heaven. I think they're thoroughly part of leading this boundary breaking, of subverting norms like that tell men that they're better and women that they're worse, and just like live outside of that. Any box that you've had, it's not part of the kingdom that I'm building. If you're saying that's more valuable than that, then it's not part of what I'm doing in the world. And it's this complete disruption of norms and boxes and boundaries, as you say. And so, I talked about how gender expansive people can be such models in this kingdom, and that queerness is such a gift to to the example of Jesus, and actually think Jesus lived that way, and you could say that Jesus was queer as well. I mean, what's more queer than God and humans and like joining together? Is like, that's a whole boundary blurring between God and humanity. Like, put them together and you've really broken a box there, or broken a line. So I think my queerness is part of that leadership of that alternative way, and that way of leading others into the way of God and the way of Jesus and this alternative way of doing life. Went on a bit of a tangent there.
No, wow, I loved it. I loved it all. I hope that more Christian institutions start thinking the way that you think. I guess, unfortunately, mainstream Christian church institutions don't, and we see that presently in the Religious Discrimination Bill, which supposedly aims to protect Australians from discrimination based on their religious beliefs, which is obviously a good thing, but it can be used to not so good ends. So I'm interested in your perspective on this bill and what its potential impact will be.
Yeah, I've done a lot of speaking publicly about the bill, and a number of people within our church community have shared their stories of being teachers in schools or Christian universities and actually being fired for being gay, and students being exposed to really awful bullying and discriminatory remarks, and so there's this history of the way that queer people are being treated in Christian organisations that is, people are sharing those stories now, and it's coming out that like this is the discrimination that happens, and this bill seeks to actually legalise that discrimination. And I think what's wrong with it is the fact that it protects religious people above other people. You know, if it was just about protecting religious people, great, but it's overriding the protection of other people, and that's what's wrong with it. And the church has this narrative in its head that it is being persecuted, when really its history in, colonised Australia, let's not say Australia for its whole history, colonised Australia has been incredibly privileged in society, and now it's starting to get critiques, and like right critiques. There's been awful misconduct and abuse in these institutions for years that has just been unchecked. There are perspectives about women and queer people that people are saying, hey, is that like, we don't like that. And actually, we see a lot of harm coming from that. And the church has just said, we're being persecuted, we're losing our rights. When actually, no, you're just becoming more equal, and you're now on an equal playing field to critique and conversation, where historically you've had so much privilege and platform in our society, and now it's just, it's becoming more normal.
That resonates across so many spheres, right? So whenever an individual or institution is incredibly privileged, when they get drawn back same level as everyone else, it seems like they're being persecuted, but it's like, no, we're actually on an even playing field now. So yeah, that really resonates. I love how you described it as putting, religious people and their beliefs above the safety of other people and groups. And I agree that that's the main problem with the bill. I guess I want to move now to the LGBT plus community and how Christianity is viewed in that community, because sometimes I feel like there's a bit of a stigma and conflict. So I guess moving through that community, how do you feel as an openly, non-binary Christian pastor?
Yeah, it's funny because I've recently been dating and on dating apps. And I've wondered if having like Christian or even the job as a pastor, like I think that's I think that it's a point of awkwardness for people, or they're like don't really know where to go. Like potentially no one wants to date me because I have that on my profile, or because I'm like saying that very upfront. So like maybe there's that. I don't really know if like maybe it's just me. But then people who know me, I think I know that it's there. There's a real tension there. And when a lot of people have been so hurt, I've experienced that. I know so many people who have experienced that. So if you cannot relate to Christians or churches anymore because your trauma is so hard, like, I get it. And that's why the tension is there. But for me personally, I think people have just really known me in the queer community, and it hasn't really been a problem. But yeah, it's there, and it's difficult. There is a grind.
Yeah. Well, from my personal experience of knowing you, it's been really, I guess, expansive would be a good word, because it's sort of made me interrogate some of the stigma that I might have had against religion and, Christianity, not maybe as pronounced as other people, but realizing that, you can actually, I see us as having a lot of common ground in the way we see things. And while I don't have faith, I don't think there's necessarily a conflict in our core values, which I see as really similar. So hopefully a lot of LGBT plus people can kind of move to that and I guess approach this with curiosity and openness as opposed to judgment, because you kind of don't want to perpetuate the same judgments that you yourself have been victim of. But at the same time, I totally understand when there's so much complex trauma, sometimes that can just be really triggering. So it's a difficult dance, I guess.
It is, yeah. And I think that's just where, relationships are so important, right? Like your potential, whatever, what you've just described is about like meeting someone like me, and then, me meeting someone like XYZ, whoever will like break down some of my stigmas, and that's why like relationships with people outside of our echo chamber are so important. Is that you never know what you might be surprised by.
Exactly. And I guess moving more to you and your sort of personal goals for the future, that's sort of in a way the epitome of what you're trying to do with your advocacy work within the church as well. So where do you see yourself in the future as a pastor and an advocate?
Yeah, I think I see myself as someone who wants to continue to cultivate safe and open spaces for people to discover God, if that's something that they want to do. If you're someone who wants to explore God, but traditionally or historically your experiences have been harmful or there's been barriers, I really want to keep creating spaces where you can do that. And then I talk about being like a writer of theology and stories. So part of what I did with my thesis was tackle this verse, Matthew 19:12, which has historically been used in queer discriminatory ways or to reinforce a binary. And then I interrogated it and said, actually, this figure is not a binary. Like they don't fit in to gender norms, and they're actually challenging gender norms. And so being a queer person who reads scripture and then writes about that, and tells that story and reinterprets, kind of contributes to the tradition or the Christian tradition in a way that can expand the conversation. I really want to do that, as well as just share stories, because I've just realised time and time again that the one thing that people can't argue with you about or debate with you about when there's so much divisive rhetoric and debate and ideas is like, you can't argue with my story and you can't argue with someone else's story. That like if they're saying, this is my experience, this is the way I've been hurt, and when you continue to act in this way and say the same things, I'm going to keep being hurt. And that's exactly what's happening for me. That's the one way we will dismantle some of this divisive, anti-queer, agenda within the church, which is just there. So I guess I want to cultivate safe spaces. I want to contribute writing to like the theology and biblical studies of the church, and then I want to continue sharing stories in the hope that people will listen and learn from them and want to do better. and find themselves in our stories.
Well, thank you, Steff. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
It's been so good being here. Thanks, Ally.